Hello and welcome to the fourth part of our review in preparation for the STAAR test. This portion is going to cover the civil rights movements that occur primarily during the 1950s to the 1970s. Backing up though, civil rights reform has been happening in the United States since before the Civil War. We talked about how there were various movements going on for reform prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, we talked about that a lot of people are sort of wanting to go back to their daily lives. They want to really not focus on reform, but more on recovering from this war effort. Then, with the rise of technology in the Gilded Age, we really do see not a lot of focus on it. However, during the Progressive era, we start to see people advocating for change. Of the things that had occurred during the Gilded Age, like the rise of Jim Crow, various things like this. So, one of these big leaders is Ida B. Wells, who was a massive advocate for getting rid of lynching, which was a practice used by the KKK to inspire fear and to really try and keep the African American population subjugated. She was a muckraking journalist. She had seen lynchings while living in the South. She went to the North, wrote many articles and several texts on this that really made people see the horrors of lynching and why it needed to be abolished in the South. W. Du Bois was another leader that we talked about. He wanted to end racism through the education of African Americans. He thought that in every population there was a talented tenth that should be those leading really their race and leading what was going on in their population. And he thought if you educated this 10%, that then everyone would be better off. So he founds the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which helps to secure full legal equality for minority citizens. In opposition to him, or working alongside him, depending on how you want to view it, is Booker T. Washington. He advocates of ending racism through vocational training. So we read his Atlanta Compromise speech, where he basically advocates that whites should see African Americans not as adversaries, not as someone who's under them, but as someone who is useful to them and is doing work that they could use for their own advantage. We talked about the analogy of like casting down your bucket where you are and using the resources that you have. Booker T. Washington sees this as like a subjugated position, and we read his speech on Booker T. Washington and others who said that basically they were keeping themselves down. And we had talked about how remembering these two gentlemen in parallel would be important for the 1950s to see these themes reoccurring in African American movements. In the 1920s, we have during World War I and up till about 1930 what is called the Great Migration. However, I said, there are various things we call the Great Migration in American history, but this is the migration where African Americans leave the rural South because of sharecropping, because of Jim Crow, to gain factory jobs in the urban North, where they think there will be more opportunity. What happens is they move into neighborhoods like the Harlem neighborhood in New York, and people who had been living in isolated rural communities come together and sort of say, hey, in your community, what were y'all doing? What was the literature? What was the poetry? What was the jazz? What was, et cetera, et cetera. And they form these very interesting different writing movements, jazz movements, various things like this, which helps to increase African American pride, attacks racism, also establishes like these very prominent musical artistic forms that are purely American art forms. Another leader, Marcus Garvey, is at the same time encouraging African Americans to separate from white society and move to Africa to gain equality. He's working in what we call the Pan-African movement that basically says that you got to give up on America and start your own community, which is isolated, which again we can talk about in the 1960s as being a parallel to Stokely Carmichael, Black Panthers, things of this nature. Question, answer. So, after World War II, we see a pretty big push for civil rights. The reason is abroad, you've been fighting Hitler, you've been looking at what racism has caused with the Holocaust and various things of this nature. So, when you return home to segregation, you return home to racism, this seems antithetical to what's been happening. So, in the military, President Truman desegregates the armed forces after World War II, which is going to open up whole new avenues to things being desegregated. Jackie Robinson on the social front is rising to prominence in the 40s when he helps to bring an end to racial segregation in Major League Baseball, and we're starting to see small changes in what is segregated in the United States. Question, answer. What we see in the 1950s is a move to using litigation, aka the court systems, to gain equality. So in 1954, The Supreme Court hears the case Brown versus Board of Education. One of the lawyers on the case, Thurgood Marshall, will later become the first African American Supreme Court justice. And the argument here is that the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that segregation is fine so long as there are two facilities, it's equal. They argue that no, that's not true, that anytime you have two facilities, one is inherently going to be unequal to the other because one is going to receive more resources, etc. In the case, the Marshall Court agrees with the argument that's being made, and they agree that yes, separate but equal is inherently unequal, and say that schools and various other facilities do need to be integrated. However, we have talked about in the past that court cases don't magically make everything happen. We talked about how even magically, people do not listen to the court, aka, Andrew Jackson. So it's going to be a while before we actually see this come into practice. But this prompts the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the integration of public schools, and various other things. It lays the legal framework for suing for these various things. In opposition to the civil rights movement, we have government officials in the South who are very much against it. Remember that in the 1960s, the Democratic Party splits into two factions. You have the more liberal Democratic Party, really the focus of Kennedy, of Johnson, people that are more in support of the civil rights movement. And then you have the more conservative faction who really tries to adhere to the Democratic Party of the 1800s, the Democratic Party of the Civil War. And they really are about states' rights, and they're about maintaining the status quo, maintaining segregation. These governors of these states, like Orville Fabius, who's the governor of Arkansas, who was there during the Little Rock Nine, Lester Maddox, the governor of Georgia, who has the campaign slogan, "If I go to jail," basically saying he plans to confront the national government, and George Wallace of Alabama, who makes the famous speech, "Segregation now, segregation forever," and who in 1968 will run for president and garner a huge showing of support, basically say that integration will not happen. This really shows that in the 1960s, there is still a big portion of the country who are willing to vote for people that really only stand for segregation. And so this is still a very divisive issue up through the 1960s in the United States. Question, answer. In the African American Civil Rights Movement, the first phase of it is nonviolent. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1954 is basically trying to integrate the bus system. It really starts when Rosa Parks starts the bus boycott by being arrested for not giving up her seat. After her arrest, through the churches, various people advocate that there should be a boycott where African Americans will not use the buses. Also, white supporters will not use the buses. And they hope to use their economic advantage to really make the bus system need to integrate because they can't function without the money that their clientele was giving them. This is where Martin Luther King is going to rise to prominence. And then he will become the big leader through the 1950s and the 1960s for this nonviolent section. He is influenced by the teachings of Gandhi and the practice that he did in India. And he really is what's going to be the impetus for the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the March on Washington. He's best known for being the ideological leader through his speeches like the I Have a Dream speech or his letter from Birmingham jail, both of which you read, and helped to increase support for the civil rights movement. And he's going to be active from 1954 with the Montgomery bus boycott all the way through his death in 1968. As the civil rights movement progresses, and after several years of people seeing that nonviolence isn't accomplishing as much as they would have hoped, there starts to be a movement for self-defense. So imagine, like I said, that you've watched your parents march and be beaten and arrested, and you're now a young student and you're seeing these sorts of things, and the Vietnam War is going on, you're feeling very angry. So the idea of sitting and taking a beating may not be as appealing as it might have been to your parents or to someone else. And so Black Power movements, Black nationalism led by Malcolm X and things like this are more militant and say that there really has to be a mutual respect and that doesn't build by you letting someone beat you. A level above that are the Black Panthers, who put it all out there and say they are willing to use violence to gain equality. And the Black Panthers start as a movement to protect Oakland. They do lunch programs for kids. They police their own areas. but we really remember them as the people with guns, with the berets, look like they're in military uniforms, really as this militant group. They're led by Stokely Carmichael, who, remember, we read the speech about him, that he was just tired of being beaten, tired of being thrown in jail, and was ready to fight back. Okay, make sure you can answer this. So, politically at the national level, we have the Great Society. President Johnson wants to end poverty and racial injustice caused by discrimination, and in order to do this, he passes a few things. First, his plan to end poverty is through Medicare, which provides aid to the elderly, and Medicaid, which provides aid to those who are economically underprivileged. The Economic Opportunity Act, the EOA, provides job training for underprivileged youths and helps to reduce this income gap. In addition to wanting to end poverty, he also wants to end discrimination. It's really only because of the support from the death of Kennedy, because he was a very influential member of Congress, and because he is a Southerner and kind of has that Southerner cred, that he is able to get some of the more progressive legislation passed. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, ethnic origin in public places, and this is going to give the federal government the power to go in and integrate these facilities. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminates the literacy test, so more people are eligible to vote in the South, and is going to allow the federal government to go in and look at elections that are happening in the South and make sure that they're not being violated. And finally, affirmative action is a policy where they seek to basically make up for all of the discrimination that was happening in the past and allow for more opportunities for minorities to attend college and things of this nature. The Constitution is also being changed in this time. We talked about that after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed, the free citizens vote, that basically reduce these sort of restrictions for slavery, inequality, and voting. The 24th Amendment, passed in the 1960s, helps to eliminate the poll tax, which makes more people eligible to vote. This, again, isn't only just African Americans, it's also anyone who just can't pay to vote. So, alongside the African American civil rights movement, there are other civil rights movements growing up. We talked about the 1950s and the 1960s being this era of change, and that each of these movements are really developing sort of in their own area and are then sort of emerging in the 1960s as this massive movement. After World War II, Hector P. Garcia works with the GI Forum to end discrimination against Mexican Americans in Texas. Many Mexican Americans had served in the war, and when they came home, they were eligible for the GI benefits, but weren't applying for them or weren't able to apply to them for various reasons. So the GI Forum helps to ensure that Hispanic veterans receive the same benefits that other veterans got, which is incredibly powerful in ensuring that they're making this move to the middle class. So if they are given a free education, low interest loans, things of this nature, they're going to be given a huge opportunity that they otherwise would not have had. So this is helping to ensure there's a strong base of middle class Mexican Americans, which is going to lead to them being able to advocate more for reform. The Chicano movement we think of as happening in the 1960s, 1970s, and these are various movements to basically have appreciation for Mexican American culture through the Chicano mural movement, which are the murals painted in the ethnic neighborhoods that show the past, present, future of Hispanic cultures, but also through the various movements that are being made to improve the lives of farm workers. Cesar Chavez is the one that we usually remember with this. During the progressive era, we saw lots of labor reform for factories, but not for farm workers. Because during the progressive era, if you were a farmer, you usually worked on a small family farm of your own. So they weren't the same sort of like labor protections for farm workers as there were for factory workers. So he works to make sure that farm workers are given these same sort of protections, that they are not being worked for long hours, they're not being given super low pay, and that they are being treated not to hazardous chemicals and things of this nature. He does this by supporting boycotts of certain crops like grapes and lettuce, and this encourages legislators to pass laws to improve the lives of farm workers. He works closely with Dolores Huerta. Remember that she was working with this movement, but also specifically with women and children to help them receive rights as well. So there was lots of litigation, again, court cases that were being passed. We talked about three that help to desegregate schools, Mendes versus Westminster, DeGavo's Bastrop, and Edgewood versus Kirby. But Edgewood versus Kirby, we talked about, also increased funding for students in poor school districts. We said that schools are funded through property tax, and so if you live in an area with low property values of houses, the amount going to your school is going to be very low. So this is also sometimes called Robin Hood, where it ensures that schools that do not have a lot of money because of low property tax are being funded at the same level. Hernandez versus Texas is a case that basically says that there will not be discrimination on juries. This is the case where a Mexican American was tried by an all-white jury where Mexican Americans had been excluded from being on this jury, and that under the 6th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, this should not be happening. So this is going to ensure that juries are more fair, therefore our legal system is more fair. And finally, White versus Register requires that districts accurately represent the portions of their racial groups in their areas. So through gerrymandering, minorities were being minority communities were being cut through, and they were not having the same voice. We looked at different ways that you could gerrymander and repopulate the portions of Dallas so that there would be less of this. So just read as the districting practice so that there will be communities that are able to elect representatives from their community that will reflect their concerns more. Question, answer. Question, answer. So, the American Indian movement, as one of you said in class, oh yeah, the Indians. This is kind of where we are at this point of history also. Native Americans, after the Dawes Act, after Wounded Knee, these various things, we have not really looked a lot at them because they were relegated to reservations while the rest of society was doing other things. And really for this course, we didn't talk about much that was happening. The one thing we did talk about was the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 that gave full equality to Native Americans. That's the extension of the 14th Amendment. But other than that, we hadn't talked about them much else other than to say code talkers. However, the American Indian movement seeks to raise awareness and to change public opinion of Native Americans, to gain greater respect for their heritage, their point of view. They occupy Alcatraz Island, they occupy Wounded Knee, and they use the slogan Red Power to draw attention to their conditions. This helps to provide more benefits, but again, we said that the Native American reservations are some of the most impoverished areas of the United States, and that there's still people advocating to get change happening. Question, answer. Women's liberation is another movement that's happening during the 60s where women are also fighting to be recognized as equal. The Acts of 1964 basically protect you for everything except gender. So they start to work on the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, that would apply the same protections for gender. The idea is that women are being paid unequal amounts for equal work, and that they're not being given the same advantages as men. So Betty Friedan is the big leader in this. She writes a text called The Feminine Mystique to challenge this idea that women are happy just being housewives. But the Equal Rights Amendment fails to pass because of the work of Phyllis Schlafly and other people who do not believe that there should be equality between women and men for one reason or another that we'll talk about later. Title IX is a law that helps to provide more money for women's athletics. This requires that if a school is going to give money to male athletics, they must also give it to female athletics, which gives more support for high schools and universities. So, major themes of civil rights. 1950s is litigation, so court case, court case, court case. 1960s is civil disobedience, as people get, wanting to break these laws. Because remember, to have standing in court, you must break a law, go to jail, go to court. So civil disobedience, to break the law, go to jail, go to court, to make the litigation happen. The late 60s, 1970s is self-defense. People are tired of going to jail, people are tired of being beaten, therefore they go through this process of self-defense. There's also this process of education equality because people really want their kids first to have these sorts of advantages. I've told you time and time again, if you get the question, like what order these things happen in, always go for the pathos. It's always your kids first, then other things. And there are lots of acts and amendments. You do need to know them. But again, this main theme that it starts through litigation and then moves to more radical. This has a lot to do with what's going on in the 1960s as far as like the counterculture movement, the Vietnam, the income disparity. But if you remember these things, you can really have a good picture of what's happening in this time period. So that is your civil rights movement. I hope that you understood this all. If you did not, come on into tutoring, talk with me, and I will speak with you later.